This is Vivica Williams with UATV Head to Head. The Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, these so-called republics that were created in 2014 in eastern Ukraine. Was Russia directly involved in their creation? Evidence says yes, yet the international community and the media rarely, if ever, blatantly state the obvious. So how much do you know about the origins of these fake republics? Joining us today is Paul Niland, a political commentator, who will give us a quick primer on the history and origin of these fake republics created in eastern Ukraine. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show again.
So first, what I'd like to do is to get you to tell us, our audience, about these republics and how they were created and when they started. Can you give us a quick history lesson?
Sure. What's important to remember, first of all, is that the campaign that we're seeing against Ukraine comes in many forms. And of course, we're seeing the informational element of this, where Russian propaganda consistently tries to denigrate Ukraine in any possible way. And, for example, to pretend that the reform achievements that we've had to date simply haven't existed. But the informational side is one thing. The military side is very well covered, and it's covered by various organizations. There's a recent report by a group called Polygraph Info that details the kind of Russian military equipment that's been seen inside of Ukraine. And Bellingcat is obviously another very well-known name that have, beyond doubt, proven the existence of a lot of Russian military equipment. But the third side to this is obviously a political element. And with people talking about fake news nowadays, and with people focusing on the hot part of the war, maybe the political side is overlooked, but it's equally important to look at who the early players were in the creation of these republics, if we want to call them that. And what kind of support they had from Moscow. And I think, as I say, that's an element that gets overlooked, but it certainly warrants a good degree of examination.
So take us back to 2014, because I think there are still quite a few people who don't know the history about this. Could you take us back to 2014 and tell us how these so-called republics began?
Sure. So, I mean, this happened fairly rapidly after the success of the revolution. We saw the end of the revolution, and then we saw the takeover of Crimea, which happened, the military operation started 5 days after Yanukovych fled. And I guess buoyed by the success of the relatively apparent success of the relatively quick takeover of Crimea, then we know that certain Russian players were looking at creating chaos, really, on mainland Ukraine. And we know from, there's a well-known leak called the Glaziev tapes, and we see there one of Vladimir Putin's, or hear one of Vladimir Putin's closest advisors talking about whipping up anti-Ukrainian sentiment in places such as Zaporizhia and Odessa and Kharkiv, and saying as well, similar to that which we've already done in Donetsk. And so the plan was wider. The plan was to take much more Ukrainian territory, but as it is, they're stuck with this two small parts of those two oblasts in eastern Ukraine. And it's important to remember as well that the territory that we're talking about is 3.2% of Ukraine's overall territory. Crimea is another 4%. But in the early days, after Russia was trying to create these, we have to look at who the players were and who the people were who were put into positions of power. And there were one or two locals. One noticeable local was a guy called Vladimir Markovich. He died about a month ago, in fact, by natural causes, by all accounts. But he was the person that read the Declaration of Independence of the Donetsk People's Republic. No one had heard of him. He just came from nowhere. I speak to friends of mine from Donetsk, and I say, who was he? What's his background? And shrug shoulders, right? Nobody knows. Another guy who's very prominent right now is named Denis Pushilin. Denis Pushilin wasn't completely unknown. He had actually stood for parliament previously. And the share of the vote that he won was 0.08%. These were the people that were handpicked then under a layer of Russian direction that ended up taking control of these territories. And the Russian links are also very, very obvious. We saw a chap called Alexander Borodai, and together with Igor Strelkov, who was very much involved in the military campaign and called himself the defense minister. Borodai and Strelkov are both from Moscow, and they both had previous ties with a Russian oligarch called Konstantin Malofeyev. Malofeyev is known for his close ties to the Kremlin, and another person who was in play at the same time was Vladislav Surkov. And there are photographs of Borodai after leaving Donetsk, going back to Moscow, where he's a native, and going out to the theater with Surkov. And then, you know, it's not hard to find a photograph of Surkov sitting next to Vladimir Putin because he's one of his closest aides. That's the reality. That's how these things came into being. It was an operation that was directed from overseas. It was directed from another country. They shipped in people who were not Ukrainians to create these non-entities as they are today.
So was there any grassroots movement here?
It's important to say that there were. I mean, there were one or two locals, not even one or two, a few thousand locals who actually took part in these early events. But those two oblasts, prior to the war, the regions of Lugansk and Donetsk, they had a combined population of 6.6 million people. And of those 6.6 million people, there's an interview with Strelkov, again, who called himself the defense minister, where he was complaining that he couldn't get 1,000 locals to fight with him. You know, then later on, there's interviews or footage of people such as the guy who's now dead, Givy, who was a local person, but he was in Donetsk train station one time, shouting at people. He was drunk, shouting at people, "Why aren't you fighting? Why are you leaving?" And there was one woman who answered, "We can't tell you what we really think because you've got guns." So yes, there were a few, and it's undeniable that, you know, a number of local people did participate, but it's equally undeniable that these people were nobodies. Givy, for example, we just mentioned him. He was a security guard in the supermarket.
So these people were handpicked by Russia. What happened with this referendum, with all of this, the growth of the Russian influence there?
Well, there was a referendum that was recognized by nobody, not even Russia. Russia didn't dare themselves to recognize this referendum. And I remember seeing an older gentleman. There was an interview of somebody who was leaving a polling station, and he was simply asked, "Why did you vote?" And the answer that he gave is, "Well, they told me if I vote, then the bombing will stop."
Russia is with you. Help is coming. Real help. Stay strong. According to the wish list of the Donetsk People's Republic people and to restore historical justice, we ask the Russian Federation to consider the integration of DNR into the Russian Federation. Of course I will take part. My soul aches for my Ukraine, for our country. I want peace. I want to work as we worked. Of course. If I go, I will vote no, because I think this is absolutely unacceptable. Because there are no observers, no control, no lists. You can vote wherever and however you want. This referendum is God knows what.
Wow. So the situation here, so we have now, obviously, Russian troops. They're led by Russia. Who's running the military and things? I mean, I know the answer is Russia. Can you tell me a bit more about this and the atmosphere there with who's running this?
But what we have so far in terms of military, I mentioned earlier on reports by Bellingcat and by Polygraph and various other institutions and organizations have basically done the same thing. But recently as well, there was footage that was taken just over the Russian side of the border, close to Rostov. And Rostov is known to be the staging area, one of the central points for the invasion forces that are crossing over into Ukraine. And the Reuters footage showed a fresh delivery of tanks that are there, and the organizations I've already mentioned, they've pinpointed exactly which tanks these are, identified what model numbers they are, found out when they were produced, and beyond doubt, we know that they were never issued to the Ukrainian army. They can't have been taken over as trophies from the Ukrainian army. Right. They're Russian-supplied weapons and Russian-supplied manpower as well. I mean, one of the issues. Well, one of the points in Minsk is that the entire territory that is currently what we call the occupied territories, or the territories not under the control of the central government, that should all be monitored by the OSCE, and that means up to and including the border. But the OSCE actually has access to 2 small border monitoring posts, and from either direction they could probably see a half a mile, and there's 430 kilometers of border that's currently open. So, almost all of this, we cannot see what crosses over. But even at those crossing points where the OSCE are sitting, they witness thousands and thousands of people crossing over wearing military fatigues, and they do so very blatantly and joke about going on fishing trips and so on and so on. They're really just taking the mickey.
Right. So how is it possible that the Minsk agreements, and we talked about this in the past, can actually work? Is this really just kind of a facade here?
No, I don't think the Minsk agreements are a facade at all. And
not the Minsk agreements, but the activities there on the Russian side and in these occupied republics. There seems to be no attempt, as you said, even to hide what's going on here.
Yes, because the reason why Russia can blatantly get away with not upholding their commitments to Minsk is because there aren't any sanctions, there aren't any penalties that are specified for failure to comply. And there are lots of things that need to be done by both parties. There are things that Ukraine needs to address as well, and it's only fair to point that out. But the things that Ukraine has to do, for example, is to pass a law on the modalities of conducting an election in that part of Ukrainian territory. But that can't happen until there's peace on the ground. That peace must be monitored for a period of time by an international body, whether that's the OSCE or more people are talking about the United Nations now potentially having a role there.
With the peace.
That's what has to happen. And
without being able to have this free organization, free monitoring, this is not actually even possible. Well, let's go back to the international media's role. So we have all of these different terms that are used. The civil war, which for the most part is no longer used, the so-called republics, the separatists, Russian-backed rebels. What with all these terms, and are having so many terms creating, sort of making this not seem as significant as it is?
It's very difficult to get a consensus on what kind of language should be used. One thing that's an easy rule of thumb, and it's a mistake I say often, but people say Russian separatists. Well, they can't be both, right? They're either Russians or they're separatists. And so any Ukrainians that are involved can be termed separatists, but Russians are Russians, and they're in another country where they have no business. Over the course of the conflict, the terminology has been refined, and people have called it a hybrid Russian separatist conflict. It's difficult to pin down an exact term that is correct. But what we have to do is we have to look at what is the obvious and demonstrable Russian command and control, not just of the military, but also of the political structures that they're attempting to create there as well. And that then demonstrates the true nature of this conflict. This conflict is a conflict of aggression by Russia against Ukraine.
And so why doesn't the international media, and not just the international media, call it that? This is a blatant and obvious invasion. So why isn't it called this?
I think you have to go back to the early days of the conflict, maybe when the summer of 2014, when things in the Donbass were at their hottest. There's a very good journalist in Kiev called Ewan MacDonald, and he wrote a blog post at the time called "Putin's Frog in a Pot War," and he lays out the premise that if you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, he's going to jump out straight away. if you put him in to cold water and then just turn up the heat ever so gradually, bit by bit by bit by bit, then it doesn't notice what's happening to it. And you know, Putin has essentially done the same thing. It's been a creeping invasion, and you know, the international media often feel that they have to present some kind of neutrality by reporting what each side is saying, that you know, Ukraine is saying this or the EU is saying that, whereas Russia says. And the only correct caveat, if you know, you're quoting what Russia is saying about the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the only correct caveat to put against that is despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So Russia denies, however, the evidence is stark. It is blatant that Russia is very obviously involved here in those three elements that we mentioned earlier on, not only the military conflict, not only the information warfare, but also in the establishment of the political structures there as well.
Well, let's go back to what you're saying about the political structures. So what's going on now in these areas with this change in the way it's run and in the politics?
It's very difficult to try and get an understanding of how things are working inside of the occupied areas, because they very tightly control the journalists that are allowed in there. So they've from leaks that have come out in recent months, you know, they've monitored and analyzed every kind of output that came from reporters, foreign reporters that were in there, including Canadian reporters, including British reporters, and then based on that they decide who they will allow to come back in and who they will not. And the kind of reporting that I've seen from inside there was a very good piece on Vice News by a journalist called Jake Hanrahan about 4 or 5 months ago, where he was being corralled, being taken around to speak to specific people, teachers and soldiers and so on. But while he was able to freely make his own comment to camera, he was saying that this is all a show, this is all a put on, and he understood clearly that what they were being shown was created for the purpose of their trip. So it's hard to get an accurate picture, but we know that what's going on there is a very intense information war to infect the minds of the people that are resident there, and that has been going on since day one. The very first thing that they did when they came in was they turned off Ukrainian television so that they could broadcast only their own TV. But the great interesting thing about that is it demonstrates how in actual fact, you can start to turn around people's opinions when you control the information waves, because it was the first thing that they did. If it wasn't that important, they wouldn't have grabbed that first, TV towers and so on.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening conversation, as always, with you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to talk to you again, Vivica.
Thank you. And today we've been joined by Paul Niland, political commentator. We talked about what's going on in the occupied territories, how they were created and organized, and Russia's role. This is Vivica Williams with UATV, and now you know. Thank you.